July 12, 1979. Knickerbocker Avenue, Brooklyn, New York. The tomatoes were still on the vine. At 1:45 in the afternoon, Carmine Galante sat in the garden of Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant, a place he had eaten at dozens of times, a place that felt, perhaps, like safety. He was eating lunch, grilled fish, a cigar clamped between his teeth. 2 bodyguards flanked him. 3 men shared his table. It was over in seconds. 3 gunmen in ski masks entered through the restaurant. They moved without hesitation. They knew exactly where to go. Within moments, Galante and 2 others were dead in the garden. The bodyguards, his own men, stepped aside. That detail would be buried in the noise of the headlines. The press called it a mob hit. The FBI called it a power struggle. Federal prosecutors built a narrative, tidy, convincing, and almost certainly incomplete. They pointed to the commission, the 5 families, a vote taken in a boardroom that smelled of cigarettes and old leather. But the men who authorized the killing were not the men the government named. The men who needed him dead had reasons that went far beyond territory or heroin routes. Carmine Galante did not die because he was too violent. He died because he was too close to winning. This is the story they never fully told. To understand why Carmine Galante had to die, you must first understand what he was made of, not the mythology, the architecture. He was born on February 21, 1910, in East Harlem, Manhattan, the son of Sicilian immigrants who had crossed the Atlantic with nothing but language and labor. The neighborhood was a pressure cooker. Poverty was not a condition. It was a climate. For a boy with Galante's temperament, it was also an education. He did not drift into crime. He accelerated toward it. By 17, he had already accumulated an arrest record that suggested something beyond ordinary juvenile delinquency. He was not stealing out of hunger. He was asserting dominance. There is a distinction, and the men who would later recruit him understood it immediately. His first serious brush with consequence came in 1930, a shootout with police that left a patrolman wounded and a young girl dead in the crossfire. Galante was 20 years old. He served time. He emerged unmoved. That psychological stillness, the absence of visible remorse, was not pathology to the men watching him. It was a credential. By the late 1930s, he had drawn the attention of Vito Genovese and, more critically, Joseph Bonanno, 2 men of entirely different styles. Genovese was political, calculating, and deeply paranoid. Bonanno was dynastic. He thought in generations, not transactions. Both saw in Galante the same thing, an instrument of force with the discipline to follow structure and the coldness to exceed it when necessary. Bonanno took him in. That decision would shape the next 4 decades of American organized crime and would ultimately produce the conditions of Galante's own destruction. He was not recruited despite his nature. He was recruited because of it. The same qualities that made him valuable would one day make him intolerable. Joseph Bonanno ran his family like a medieval court. There were rules of succession, codes of loyalty, and a carefully maintained distance between the administration and the violence it required. Bonanno himself projected the image of a statesman, measured, patrician, a man who preferred negotiation to bloodshed, not out of mercy, but out of efficiency. Carmine Galante was his enforcer. His blade kept out of sight until needed. Through the 1940s and into the 1950s, Galante rose steadily through the Bonanno hierarchy, not through charm or political maneuvering, but through an unblemished record of results. Assignments completed, problems resolved, no loose ends, no unnecessary complications. In an organization where reliability was the ultimate currency, Galante accumulated wealth quietly and without fanfare. But there was a dimension to his ambition that Bonanno either underestimated or chose to ignore. Galante was not content to serve indefinitely. He studied power the way a surveyor studies land, identifying boundaries, measuring distances, calculating what could be claimed and when. He watched how decisions were made at the top of the commission. He observed the relationships between family bosses, the courtesies exchanged, the debts accumulated, the moments when authority was borrowed rather than owned. He filed all of it away. His most consequential assignment came in the early 1950s when Bonanno sent him to Montreal. Ostensibly, the mission was to extend Bonanno influence into Canadian territory, a relatively routine expansion of criminal infrastructure. In practice, it was far more significant than that. Montreal in the early 1950s was a gateway. The city sat at the intersection of European smuggling networks and North American distribution channels. Heroin moving from the Sicilian refineries, processed from Turkish morphine base, could enter the continent through Montreal with considerably less scrutiny than through New York's hardened port operations. Galante recognized this not merely as a logistical advantage, but as a strategic foundation. He began building relationships, not just with Canadian criminals, but directly with Sicilian suppliers.
He inserted himself into the transatlantic chain at a structural level, not as a buyer, but as a connector, a guarantor, a man whose word meant the product would move and the money would return. By the time he came back to New York, he was no longer simply Bonanno's enforcer. He was the architect of what federal agents would later call the French Connection's lesser-known successor, a heroin pipeline that would, within 2 decades, flood American cities and generate revenues that dwarfed anything the Commission's traditional rackets could produce.
He had found his empire. He had also found his vulnerability, because the men who sat at the top of the Commission had not authorized this. They had not been consulted, and in the world Galante now moved through, the failure to consult was not an oversight. It was a declaration. By the late 1950s, the Commission had a problem it could not openly discuss. Heroin was making certain men extraordinarily wealthy. It was also making them extraordinarily dangerous, to the public, to law enforcement patients, and to the careful political insulation the 5 families had spent decades constructing. The Commission's official position, articulated most forcefully by Carlo Gambino, was that narcotics were forbidden. The penalties for dealing within the organization were death. This was not morality. It was risk management. The calculus was straightforward. A soldier convicted of murder might endure decades of prison without cooperating. A soldier convicted of narcotics trafficking, facing the same sentence with the added weight of federal mandatory minimums, was a far less predictable man. Drugs invited federal jurisdiction. Federal jurisdiction invited pressure. Pressure produced informants. The Commission understood this chain of consequence with the clarity of men whose survival depended on it. Galante understood it too. He proceeded anyway. In 1958, federal authorities arrested him on narcotics conspiracy charges connected to the very pipeline he had spent years constructing through Montreal and his Sicilian contacts. The case was substantial. The evidence, painstakingly assembled over years of surveillance, was difficult to contest. In 1962, he was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. He served 12. What happened during those 12 years is as important as anything that occurred before them. Prison did not reform Carmine Galante. It concentrated him. Stripped of the daily operations, the meetings, the movement, he was left with time, and he used it the way a chess player uses a long pause, reviewing every position on the board, identifying every weakness in every opponent. He also maintained contact. The Sicilian connections he had cultivated did not dissolve during his incarceration. If anything, they deepened, sustained through intermediaries, through family channels, through the kind of patient correspondence that suggested a man planning a return rather than serving a sentence. When he was released in 1974, the landscape had shifted. The Bonanno family had been weakened by internal war. The banana split conflict of the late 1960s had fractured loyalties, diminished the family's standing on the Commission, and left the administration in a state of managed dysfunction. The family that had elevated Galante was now, in certain critical respects, dependent on him. He recognized the inversion immediately. He did not ease back into the organization. He re-entered it like a man reclaiming property. Within months, he had reasserted control over the heroin network. Within a year, he was effectively running the Bonanno family, not as official boss, a title still held by others on paper, but as the gravitational center around which all significant decisions orbited. He brought in Sicilian recruits directly, men who answered to him personally, bypassing the traditional American hierarchy entirely. These were not inducted members of the American Cosa Nostra. They operated outside the Commission's sanctioned structure. They were loyal to Galante alone. To the other family bosses watching from a careful distance, this was no longer ambition. This was succession planning. And they had not been asked. There is a moment in the life of every criminal organization when politics and violence become indistinguishable. For the American Commission in the late 1970s, that moment had a name. Carmine Galante was not simply accumulating power in the way ambitious men within the Mafia had always accumulated power, gradually through negotiation, through the careful exchange of favors and debts that constituted the organization's internal diplomacy. He was doing something categorically different. He was constructing a parallel structure, a vertical monopoly over the most lucrative criminal enterprise in the country, controlled entirely by men who owed their allegiance not to the Commission, not to the traditions of American Cosa Nostra, but to a single individual. The other bosses had seen consolidation before. They had never seen this. Carlo Gambino had died in 1976, and with him went the last figure of sufficient stature to contain Galante through the subtle application of institutional authority. Gambino's successor, Paul Castellano, was a businessman, intelligent, cautious, deeply averse to unnecessary conflict. He was not equipped, temperamentally or politically, to confront Galante directly.
Neither was Anthony Corallo of the Lucchese family nor Frank Thierry, who nominally led the Genovese organization with studied ambiguity. These were administrators. Galante was a force of nature wearing a suit. What changed the equation was not courage. It was arithmetic. By 1978, federal intelligence assessments, later declassified and reviewed by organized crime historians, estimated that the Bonanno family's heroin operation was generating revenues that eclipsed the combined gambling and loan sharking income of two other families combined.
Galante controlled the supply chain from Sicily to the street. He controlled the pricing. He controlled the distribution network through his Sicilian recruits, whom law enforcement had begun calling the Zips, a derogatory term for recent Sicilian immigrants whose insularity made them nearly impossible to infiltrate. The Zips answered to no one in America but Galante. This meant that if Galante chose, and there was growing evidence he was moving toward this choice, he could demand tribute from the other families for access to product their own street operations depended upon. He would not be asking for a seat at the table. He would be presenting an invoice to the men already seated. The FBI, meanwhile, was watching all of it. The Bureau's intelligence on the Commission during this period was more sophisticated than the public record suggested. Informants inside multiple families were reporting the same anxiety through different voices. The Commission was paralyzed, not by indecision, but by a structural reality that made legitimate action nearly impossible. To move against Galante required consensus. Consensus required meetings. Meetings generated evidence. And any evidence of a commission-sanctioned murder of a sitting family boss would hand federal prosecutors exactly the kind of coordinated conspiracy case they had been building toward for years. The very mechanisms designed to protect the organization had become the obstacle to its self-preservation. There was, however, a solution. It did not require commission authorization if the men who carried it out were Galante's own. The genius of what followed, and it must be called genius, however cold, was that the most effective weapon against Carmine Galante was the structure he had built himself, his reliance on a tight inner circle, his deliberate isolation from the broader organization, his certainty, born of years of dominance, that the men closest to him were beyond suspicion. He had spent his career making himself untouchable from the outside. He had not considered what could reach him from within. On the morning of July 12, 1979, Carmine Galante made a decision that revealed something essential about the psychology of men who have held absolute power for too long. He left his bodyguards at home. Not all of them. He brought two, Leonardo Coppola and Giuseppe Turano, men from his inner circle, men he had elevated personally. But the broader security apparatus that a man of his profile and his enemies should have maintained was absent. He traveled to Joe and Mary's restaurant in Bushwick, Brooklyn, with the casual confidence of someone who had concluded, somewhere in the architecture of his own certainty, that he had already won. This was not carelessness. It was a symptom. Men who have successfully intimidated everyone around them for decades begin to confuse fear with loyalty. The silence of potential enemies reads, after a while, as submission. Galante had watched the other bosses absorb his expansion without visible resistance. He had introduced his Sicilian recruits into American operations without commission reprisal. He had, by every observable measure, faced down the most powerful criminal organization in the country and encountered nothing but accommodation. What he could not see was the conversation happening in the negative space, in rooms he was not invited to, between men who smiled at him across tables and reported to others the moment he left. The three men who shared his table that afternoon were not there by coincidence. Salvatore Catalano, Cesar Bonventre, Baldo Amato, all Zips, all men Galante had personally imported from Sicily and placed at the center of his operation, all men whose loyalty he considered beyond question, precisely because they were his creation. The commission had not sent gunmen from outside. It had not needed to. The authorization, and the historical record here remains contested but compelling, had been obtained through indirect channels. The Gambino and Genovese leadership had communicated, through layers of insulation, that they would not object. That was sufficient. Within the Bonanno family itself, acting boss Giacomo Ruggiero and the faction aligned against Galante needed only that silence to proceed. Galante's zips had been turned, or had never been fully his to begin with. He sat in that garden with a cigar between his teeth, surrounded by men who had already decided the afternoon's outcome and ordered lunch. The last meal was grilled fish. Galante ate without apparent concern. The garden at Joe and Mary's was small, enclosed, intimate, the kind of space that feels protected precisely because it is contained. Grapevines grew along the walls. The afternoon light fell at an angle that made the scene look, in photographs taken afterward, almost pastoral. Those photographs would be printed on the front page of every major newspaper in the country by the following morning. At approximately 2:45 in the afternoon, three men entered the restaurant from the front. They moved through the interior quickly and without hesitation, the movement of men who had walked the route before, if not physically then in sufficient mental rehearsal to eliminate uncertainty. They wore ski masks. They carried shotguns and a pistol. They entered the garden. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. Galante was struck multiple times. Leonardo Coppola, his bodyguard, was killed beside him. Giuseppe Turano, his cousin and the restaurant's co-owner, died at the same table. The two remaining men at that table, Catalano and Bonventre, survived. They had moved with a precision that, in the chaos of the moment, might have appeared to be instinct. It was not instinct. The responding officers who arrived within minutes found a scene of considerable violence compressed into a very small space. Galante lay on his back among overturned chairs. His cigar remained clamped between his teeth, a detail the press would reproduce endlessly, finding in it a symbolism that was simultaneously accurate and reductive. It suggested defiance in death. It was more likely simply the final position of a man who had no time to react. The gunmen were gone before the first siren reached Knickerbocker Avenue. No witnesses came forward with useful descriptions. The neighborhood understood, with the collective instinct of communities long accustomed to this geography of violence, that useful descriptions were not in anyone's interest. Federal prosecutors moved quickly. Within weeks, they had assembled a narrative, the commission had voted, the Bonanno faction had executed, and Galante had died because his recklessness had made him a liability to the organization he had terrorized for decades. It was a coherent story. It was supported by genuine evidence. Several of the men connected to the killing were eventually charged and convicted in subsequent proceedings. But coherence is not the same as completeness. The prosecutors identified the mechanism. They named the instrument. What they did not fully pursue, what the official record treats as settled when it remains, on careful examination, anything but, was the question of ultimate authorization. Who had given the final word? Through which channels? And what was exchanged in return for the silence that followed? Galante died in 30 seconds. The full accounting of why has never taken place in any courtroom. The federal narrative was clean, almost too clean. Within months of the killing, the Justice Department and the FBI had constructed a prosecutorial framework that placed Galante's death squarely within the understood mechanics of commission governance. A boss had become ungovernable. The governing body had acted. The system, in its brutal and self-regulating way, had corrected itself. It was, from a prosecutorial standpoint, a satisfying conclusion, one that reinforced the existing model of how the American Mafia operated and, critically, one that fit the evidence that was obtainable. The problem was not what the government found. It was what it declined to pursue. 3 figures sat at that table and survived. Salvatore Catalano, Cesar Bonventre, and Baldo Amato were questioned. Their survival was noted. The official explanation, that they had been fortunate, that the gunmen had focused on Galante and his bodyguards, was accepted with a speed that, in retrospect, reflects the institutional pressure to close the narrative rather than expand it. Catalano would later emerge as a central figure in the Pizza Connection case, one of the most significant heroin trafficking prosecutions in American history. The investigation revealed a network of Sicilian operators using pizzerias as distribution fronts, moving enormous quantities of heroin through channels that bore a structural resemblance, unmistakable to anyone examining them carefully, to the pipeline Galante had constructed and that his table companions had inherited. This was not coincidence. It was succession. The men who survived July 12, 1979, did not escape the killing. They conducted it. And what they inherited, the Sicilian supply relationships, the distribution infrastructure, the transatlantic connections Galante had spent 3 decades building, continued operating with remarkable continuity under new management. The government's framing of the assassination as an act of organizational discipline obscured this inheritance entirely. By emphasizing the Commission's role as authorizing body, prosecutors directed attention upward, toward Castellano, toward the family administrations, toward the architecture of American organized crime that RICO legislation was specifically designed to dismantle. This was legitimate and important work. Several significant convictions followed. But the Sicilian dimension, the transnational element that made Galante categorically different from the bosses who had preceded him, was treated as context rather than core. The Pizza Connection prosecution, which began in earnest in the early 1980s, would partially correct this. But by then the operational window had been open for years. There is also the question of what the FBI knew and when. Declassified documents and subsequent congressional testimony established that federal intelligence on the Bonanno family's heroin operations was considerably more advanced than the public prosecution record suggested. Informants were active. Surveillance was ongoing. The degree to which the government's intelligence apparatus had visibility into the conditions producing Galante's assassination and chose to observe rather than intervene remains, in the careful language of official inquiry, an open question. What is not open is the consequence. In the years following Galante's death, heroin availability in American cities increased. Street prices fell. The pipeline he had built did not collapse with its architect. It expanded. The organizational efficiency of the Sicilian network proved more durable than the man at its center, which suggests, to anyone examining the structure honestly, that Galante had built something that exceeded his own indispensability. The prosecutors got the murder right. They got the meaning wrong. There is a particular kind of blindness that afflicts institutions when they encounter a problem that exceeds their existing frameworks. The American justice system understood the mafia as a domestic criminal hierarchy, a pyramid with identifiable layers, prosecutable relationships, and a logic of authority that, once mapped, could be dismantled from the top down. This understanding was not wrong. It was incomplete, and the gap between those two conditions is where Carmine Galante lived, operated, and ultimately died. He was not a product of the American Mafia's internal culture in the way his contemporaries were. He was a bridge figure, a man who had moved fluidly between the insular world of the New York families and the older, harder, more patient world of Sicilian organized crime. He understood both systems from the inside. He used each to amplify the other, and in doing so, he created something the Commission could not fully control and the government could not fully see. His death resolved nothing. The Commission believed it was cauterizing a wound. It was, in fact, removing a cork. The forces Galante had organized, the supply relationships, the distribution networks, the transnational architecture of the heroin trade, did not require his continued presence to function. They required only that the men who inherited them understood their value and had the discipline to maintain them. Those men were sitting at his table. This is what makes Galante's story something beyond a conventional mob narrative. It is not, at its core, a story about violence or greed or the internal politics of criminal organizations, though it contains all of these things in abundance. It is a story about the limits of institutional understanding, about the way both criminal and governmental bureaucracies construct narratives that serve their own organizational needs and mistake those narratives for truth. The Commission needed Galante to be a problem of discipline, so they framed his elimination as an act of governance. The government needed the assassination to be a legible event within a prosecutable structure. So they pursued the mechanism and called it the answer. Neither institution had an interest in the fuller truth that a man of genuine strategic vision had constructed a criminal enterprise that transcended the boundaries both institutions were designed to police. Acknowledging that fully would have required each of them to confront the inadequacy of their own frameworks. It was easier to bury him twice, once in the garden, once in the official record, and so Carmine Galante, cigar between his teeth, fish half-eaten, surrounded by men who had already decided his fate, became a symbol of mob excess rather than what he more accurately represented, the moment when American organized crime connected irreversibly to its global infrastructure. And the people responsible for understanding that connection looked at the body and called the case closed. The garden on Knickerbocker Avenue has long since been demolished. The pipeline he built outlasted him by decades. Some things, once constructed, do not require their architect to survive.